Question 1. There's 6 key characteristics of students with learning disabilities according to the historical perspectives on learning disabilities in the United States, the article that we read. So the general characteristics are reading disabilities, which are usually the most prevalent. So is the student struggling with phonological awareness, decoding, fluency, vocabulary? The second characteristic is maybe math disabilities. Is the student struggling with computation or word problems? Then the third is memory problems with working and long-term memory. Is the student remembering those key details? Then the next one is insufficient use of learning strategies. Generally, students with learning disabilities struggle with those learning strategies that are easily understood by students without learning disabilities. Megacognition deficits. So is the student understanding and aware that they're doing something wrong? Are they realizing that they're struggling? The last characteristic is social emotional problems. Students with learning disabilities are more at risk because of repeated academic failure. The intellectual functioning of a student with specific learning disabilities is usually used with the discrepancy model. Now, that is a score that is used to identify, that some schools use to identify students with SLD. And that is based off of the IQ score and their potential achievement and where they actually are achieving. Now, learning disabilities, you might be able to get that achievement if you provide interventions like the RTI. We may overdiagnose students with SLD, or they might have to wait to fail till they get an intervention, just because of their IQ and their intellectual functioning, when it shouldn't be like that. That's why the RTI model is much more effective in that sense. Question 2. So describe the key characteristics of students with EBD. Common characteristics of students with emotional behavioral disorders, according to the NICHCY article that we read. Hyperactivity. Does the student have a short attention span? Are they impulsive? Is that what's causing the behaviors? Aggression. Is the student self-interest, acting out, fighting? So these are both the B part of the emotional behavioral disorder label. So withdrawn. As a third characteristic that this article identified. So students not interacting socially with peers due to fear or anxiety. So that's the emotional part. That's the E. Is the student being withdrawn and we're just not seeing it. Immaturity. So is there an appropriate crying, tantrums, poor coping skills? This is also a behavior. We see this. We see hyperactivity. We see aggression and self-interest behaviors. We see immaturity. And then the last one is learning difficulties. So is the student performing below grade level? And is that because of their behavioral issues? So when looking at the criteria, the students need to fall into one of the three categories. And the first two are those behavioral categories, and then the third is the emotional. So the first two deals with hyperactivity, being aggressive, being immature. And then that third one is that emotional part that, is harder for us to see as a teacher and harder for us to identify right away. Question 3. Describe how students with SLD become eligible for education services. All right, so first, there needs to be a pre-referral process in both SLD and EBD. So this is RTI. This is the start of RTI. So initial concerns need to be brought according to the student's progress. What are the concerns about the student? Are these concerns behavioral or academic? When was this initial concern brought to attention? Then there needs to be information gathered. So instructional methods used, strategies and materials that have been used. The student's skill level, the background knowledge of the student, and his experiences, the home and school expectations for behavior and academic performance. So what are the classroom behavioral techniques? So this needs to be taken into effect before qualifying a student for special ed or even bringing it to special ed's attention. Those need to be gathered so we can see where the student's at. Then the information sharing, the team and the team's decisions. So the team actually needs to meet and begin its review of the information of the collected data and start discussing the possible interventions, including the type and intensity that the student may need. So the team needs to discuss what's going on and how they can help. Then the discussion of the strategies is the fourth step of this pre-referral process. So coming up with a plan and a goal of what interventions are going to be used to assist the student. What are we going to do to assist this student with their behavioral academic needs? Then the implementation by the classroom teacher and the monitoring of the strategies. So fifth step, you have to implement the interventions to see if it's going to work or not. And then the evaluation and decision making to figure out how is it going. Does the student need to keep going on with interventions? Is there another intervention the student may need? Or does the student need to be brought to special education? Does that process need to happen? With RTI, there needs to be a universal screening as our first level. So those are the students that it's all screened. Then with the second level, it's those students that need that more intensive instruction, so tier 2. So maybe interventions to help understand a certain concept. And then the third one is the students that are still struggling with all those interventions. So before qualifying a student with SLD and EBD, there needs to be some kind of intervention happening. And there needs to be a pre-referral process before even considering it. Question 4. Based on what you've learned in this course, describe an evidence-based practice and why teachers must use evidence-based practices when they're available. So evidence-based practices involve the application of rigorous systematic objectives, procedures to obtain the reliable and valid knowledge relevant to the education's activities and programming. So what that means is that the practice needs to be researched. There needs to be a lot of research out there that supports this method. It needs to be shown that it works. So a evidence-based practice is not the same as best practice. Best practice is your own opinion, what feels good. It doesn't mean that it's evidence-based. So teachers need to use evidence-based practices when they're available because these practices are heavily researched. They're heavily researched that they work. So there's 10 steps when determining how to choose an evidence-based practice. Is you need to determine the student's environment, the students, and the instructional characteristics. Then you need to search for an evidence-based practice. Then you need to actually select a evidence-based practice that's going to work for you. Then you need to identify the essential components of the practice. What do you want to use in the practice? Then you need to implement it within the cycle of effective instructions. And you need to check, are you implementing it correctly? Then you need to monitor the student's progress, adapt if needed, then make a data-driven decision. Is it working? Is this evidence-based practice working for my class, or do I need to find another one? Then you need to share it. You need to share if this is working for you. Share it with other teachers so they can implement this too. Evidence-based practices are the best practices because they are proven through research. They're proven through your own research with your own students. Question 5. All lessons must be based on a learning objective. Explain why. All lessons need to be based off of a learning objective because this is how you assess what your students have learned. This is the assessment that needs to happen at the end of your class. Did my students understand my lesson? So if you have an awesome learning objective, then the assessment of the lesson should be clear. A measurable objective should have the following elements. It needs to have a condition. Given what? So without teacher prompt, using a word processor during a simulated or actual event. You need to give your student something. So then it needs to have a learning. The students, the learners, Tom, Mary, Steve, who are we directing this learning objective to? Then there needs to be a learning behavior. So the Bloom's taxonomy chart's really good for this. So this is that they will be able to describe, identify, compose. You cannot have understanding. They will understand this. No. It needs to be observable. Then there needs to be a criteria for evaluation. So what's mastery? What's not mastery? So at the end of your lesson, your student should be able to say, now I'm able to do what? This learning objective needs to be observable, like I just said, because that's the assessment. We can't observe a student understanding something or improving something. There needs to be a criteria, a condition, a learner, and a learner's behavior. Number 6 explicit instruction is research-based. It involves teaching a lesson according to these phases: model, guided practice, and unguided practice. So, the first stage is modeling. So, modeling consists of two different components: demonstrating, describing. The describing component needs to be a think out loud. All right, I'm doing this. All right, I see because he's struggling with this, I can infer this. It needs to be what you're thinking, what they should be thinking. A good model should be clear and concise, and the students should know what they're supposed to do. And that demonstrating part, that's when you're actually answering the question. This is what we're doing. This phase is showing the students what they're learning. So the second stage is guided practice. The purpose of guided practice is to provide the students to utilize the skill and become confident in the skill with how they're using it. This stage is where there's a high level of success because the students are often supported as they begin this new skill with a variety of different prompts to learn the skill. They are given verbal prompts, physical prompts. All these things are provided support and they become confident because they're doing it correctly. We're doing it together. And then the guided practice. So this should be similar to the guided practice. The unguided practice should be similar to the guided practice. So this is where the assessment part comes in. This is where you check for understanding, but still having that support for the students. Now, and this model is highly beneficial for students with learning disabilities because they're provided that support, because they're able to become confident with the learning strategies and the learning skills within the lesson, within guided practice. They're provided that support, and they're provided a lot of practice through modeling and guided practice and unguided practice. They're provided all that, which is extremely effective for students with learning disabilities.